Hi, I like Raspberry Pis. They're the right mix of sweet and tangy. If you add a little bit of ice cream, it's oh so delicious. But I also like Raspberry Pis. They're single board computers, meaning everything from the CPU to RAM to GPU to all of your USB ports are located on one circuit board. Everything is on it. They're great. I use my Raspberry Pi to control my 3D printer. I use a Raspberry Pi to control my telescope. I use another Raspberry Pi to also control my telescope. I sometimes do retro gaming on a Raspberry Pi. I've used a Pi with webcams as security cameras while on vacation. But you see, I have a problem, and I'm finally big enough to admit it. I am an amateur astrophotographer. And that's not even the worst of it. To be an astrophotographer, you need storage. A lot of storage. You see, when you take images of objects in space, you don't just take one long exposure. That's impractical. What you need to do is take several pictures. These individual pictures are called subframes. For one object, you might have like 500 subframes. You also have something called calibration frames to help remove noise and vignetting from your image. Take this image of Messier 33. To get this image, I needed more than 700 subframes, which equals about 30 hours of total imaging time. Those individual subs take up space. Pun intended. And that's not even the worst part. To be an astrophotographer means you're always on a budget. The hobby is expensive. I need an effective solution to store all of my photos. And that's where I saw Jeff Geerling's video on the RAT's SATA hat to build a network attached storage device, or NAS. The hat attaches to a Raspberry Pi 5 and allows you to attach up to 5 hard drives to it. It's beautiful. So I made my own. Admittedly, it's not as beautiful, but I adapted it to fit my needs. It's kind of business in the front and party in the back. A Frankenstein NAS, if you will. I love my creation. But let's see how I did it, and I'll provide reviews of how much I like the products along the way. Welcome to Deep Sky Detail. Okay, so timestamps will be given about everything we'll cover in the video. First, we'll get into why you might want a Raspberry Pi NAS, or a NAS in general. Then we'll cover the components you'll need to make a similar NAS. I'll then show you how to put together the hardware and some of the decisions I made while making it, and briefly go over the software you'll need to set it up. Then I'll review some tests to see how effective the NAS is. And finally, and this will probably be the most important part if you do want to do this project, I'll show you what is most likely to fail in the NAS and how you can make sure that failure won't be a problem. If you don't do this last step, you risk creating a huge headache for yourself later on. So let's get into it. Okay, so what is network attached storage, or NAS? Well, it's not this guy. That's NAS with a Z. Great channel, by the way. I've got his shirt. A NAS with an S is basically some sort of storage device that connects to your home's internet and can be accessed by any computer on your home internet. You can think of it like your own personal cloud storage. A lot of people use NASes for general storage, for backing up their data, or file sharing, or as a media server for their movies, or running virtual machines. If you are using the device as backup, remember to always follow the 3-2-1 principle. Have 3 copies of your data on 2 different types of media, so like an internal hard drive and a cloud storage, with one of those copies being at a different place than the other 2, like your parents' or friend's house, or the cloud. So for my astrophotography, that might mean having 1 copy of my stacked images on the computer's internal solid-state drive, 1 copy of the stacked image on a Google Drive, and the raw subframes on my Raspberry Pi NAS. That way I have at least 3 copies of my astro data At least 2 copies are on different types of storage, so the NAS versus the cloud, and 1, the Google Drive, is off-site. With a NAS, you can set up something called a RAID, or a redundant array of independent disks. What a RAID does is make all of your devices act as one large drive, or array. There are different types of RAIDs, specified by a number. So there is RAID 0, RAID 1, RAID 5, etc. Each has their own advantages and disadvantages. I'll link to a Wikipedia page that outlines the differences. But those disadvantages can be boiled down to basically 3 things: data redundancy, total usable storage, and read and write speed. Data redundancy refers to how many drives can fail without you losing any data. I'll be using a RAID 5 setup, which means one drive can fail without me losing any data. If a drive fails, I'd shut off the NAS, insert a new drive in place of the old drive, and rebuild the array. But it also means that I have 1 less drive's worth of storage for the NAS. A RAID 0 would have no data redundancy, and you wouldn't lose any drives worth of storage. So let's go into a couple of quick examples. If I used a RAID 0 that has no redundancy, I could have 4 3 terabyte drives for 12 total terabytes. The drive would have relatively fast read and write speeds because the data can be read or written from all 4 drives at once. If one drive fails, I lose all of my data. However, if I'm using a RAID 5, that means 1 drive's worth of data, or 3 terabytes, will be spread out across the 4 drives to be used as backup. So when all is said and done, I'll only have 9 terabytes of total storage, and I'm sacrificing a bit of speed because the backup information has to be written as well. There are caveats though. Rebuilding an array for a RAID 5 setup after losing a drive is not guaranteed. If your data on a good drive can't be read when you're rebuilding the array, you risk losing all of your data anyway. The more storage you have, the more likely it is to fail when you're rebuilding the array. The less reliable your drives are, the more likely the RAID will fail when rebuilding. So I wouldn't just use regular hard drives for a NAS with important data on it. Find drives that are made for NASes or are used in data centers. I also wouldn't use a RAID 5 setup with more than 10 to 12 terabytes of total data. For those, I'd use a RAID 6, which can lose 2 drives. So RAID setups can be useful, but they should not be considered as a backup for your data. You still want to follow the 3-2-1 rule, and a NAS with a RAID setup only counts as 1 backup. The main benefit I see for a Raspberry Pi 5 NAS is the price. With a Raspberry Pi 5 and RAT's SATA hat, you can have 5 drives connected for up to 100 terabytes of data. You get a 4-core, 4.6 gigahertz CPU with 8 gigabytes of RAM and gigabit Ethernet. The RAT's hat costs about $70 US. The Raspberry Pi 5 costs about $80 US. You'll also need an SD card, probably a case, cables, and a power adapter. Without the drives, you're looking at about $200 US depending on your build. We can compare that to a Synology NAS with similar specs. This one, for example, without the drives, costs about $700 US. Of course, the Synology NAS has a lot of advantages compared to the Pi. It is upgradable a little bit. You can add more drive bays later on, for example. The Ethernet is faster, and you can upgrade the Ethernet card if you want to. It's more user-friendly, it doesn't rely on an SD card for its software, so what I'm saying is that there are trade-offs. I chose the Pi because I think it's a good choice for me. I like tinkering with projects, and I like the budget aspect of it. I'll leave affiliate links to my setup as well as other options I think are decent that are easier to set up and probably a little bit more reliable. So what do you need for this? Well, I went for hard drives instead of SSD drives. The reason is the price per terabyte. SSD drives are about 2 to 3 times more expensive at the time of this recording than NAS hard drives. So I found 4 3 terabyte new Iron Wolf drives on sale for about $60 each. Compare this, for example, with relatively inexpensive 2.5-inch SSDs, which go for about $50 to $60 per terabyte. However, using SSDs instead of hard drives will give you a more compact build, theoretically might be a little bit faster, but the hard drives, at least in the short term, can give you more storage for the same amount of money. You will, of course, need a Raspberry Pi and a SATA hat. I also bought a hard drive cage, a micro SD card, an active cooler for the Pi, a 12-volt 5-amp power adapter, as well as some USB computer fans for cooling. I'll control the USB fans using a custom bash script for the Pi. Details on how I did that will be put on my Buy Me a Coffee page, but basically I created a cron job that will turn the USB ports on when the top drive in the rack goes over 40 degrees Celsius, and then turn it off when it goes below 35 degrees Celsius. Maybe cron isn't the best, but it works, and I don't feel like changing it now. So now let's look at how I assembled the thing. But first, let me thank my Buy Me a Coffee and YouTube channel members for this video. Without their support, I wouldn't be making these videos. They also help me decide what products to test by voting, and that means that the only people determining what products get reviewed on the channel are my viewers and myself. So thank you, members. You help keep this channel independent, and if you'd like to become a member, a link is pinned in the comments. Okay, so let's put this thing together. So first I have a Raspberry Pi 8 gigabit version with the SATA hat. I also have 4 3 terabyte hard drives, which I purchased on sale directly from Seagate.com. While you might find cheaper hard drives elsewhere, I wouldn't necessarily recommend going for lower quality or used ones, although some people have had success with second-hand data center drives. I'll be using a CPU cooler for the Pi, although some modifications may be necessary, and I'll get into that in a second. Additionally, I have an 128 gigabyte SD card and a hard drive enclosure, which is typically designed for installation in a PC case. I would get a much smaller SD card, like 16 gigabytes for this project. You'll know why at the end of the video. But my plan is to assemble everything and mount the drives into the enclosure, which I bought from Amazon. Once complete, the setup should have enough space for a couple of fans. Affiliate links will be pinned in the comments. The fans are simple USB-powered units. I plan to connect them to a USB hub and configure them to activate only when the CPU reaches a certain temperature threshold. Finally, I'll need a power adapter. I chose this one because it fits the SATA hat and should be sufficient to power the low-energy hard drives through the SATA interface. Now I'll begin assembling everything. Okay, so I got the case put together. Apparently I don't have screws to attach the fan, but I'll get those and attach them at some point. All I did was connect these 4 edges together. The next thing I have to do is take these brackets and put them on the hard drives and put them into slots. Initially, I assumed the screws that came with these case would fit the Seagate screws and mount them into the brackets, but that wasn't the case. Fortunately, the SATA hat included the necessary hardware. I opened the box to check, and sure enough, it came with all the required screws. The hat itself is packaged in a nice box, which I'll keep for now. With these screws, I can mount the hard drive into the bracket and slide them into place. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. I got the fan installed on all 4 drives in place. Next, we need to set up the Raspberry Pi with the active cooler. The SATA hat comes with a SATA cable that sits on top of the Pi. However, if you're using an active cooler, which I highly recommend, it won't fit evenly on the Raspberry Pi as is. To make that work, we'll need to bend some parts of the heatsink slightly to ensure a proper fit. I use pliers to remove 3 sections of the heatsink. This adjustment just allows the part to sit properly. While it's compatible with the Raspberry Pi, it doesn't fit the heatsink unless those 3 sections are removed. It should be fine once modified, but ideally you'd want to make these adjustments before attaching the heatsink to the Pi. Alright, I've got this setup assembled. It looks like everything is connected. The PCIe cable is attached. It's a bit delicate, so be careful with it. The hat comes with 2 cables, which is nice if you ever need a backup. The SATA cables are fully plugged into the SATA hat. Alright, so it's the next day and I've got the hard drives installed. I also 3D printed a base and an enclosure to protect the Pi. I tested plugging all the SATA cables from the hard drives into the Pi and initially ran into a power issue. I had ordered a 12-volt 8-amp power adapter from Amazon, but what arrived was a 5-volt 10-amp adapter. When I plugged it into the SATA hat's power input intended to power the Pi hat, Pi, and drives, it didn't work. Using a multimeter, I confirmed that only 5 volts was coming through instead of the expected 12 volts. So I returned that adapter and got the correct 12-volt 8-amp power supply. Next, I'll work on cable management and plug everything into the Pi. I'm going to attach the fan with Velcro strips, securing it in place alongside the enclosure. On first setup, it shouldn't matter which drives go into which port, but once you set up the NAS, it will matter. So keep track of which drives go into which port on the SATA hat. The setup will have 2 fans, one drawing air from the side to cool the drives, and the other pulling air from the bottom to cool the Pi. Both will be powered by USB, and I'll run a script to turn them on and off when the CPO goes between a certain threshold. I'll take care of the cable management and check back in once that's done. Alright, I've got the wiring sorted out. I also drilled holes in the bottom of the 3D printed case to allow for more airflow from the fans. I also printed the top. Now I just need to connect the new power cord and plug in the Ethernet cable to my modem. Next, I'll install Open Media Vault and set this up as a NAS. Okay, so the software setup is not hard, but it does take a bit of time. There are better tutorials out there, but I'll briefly go over the steps I used to set up everything on my home network. Hopefully I didn't miss any steps, and if I did, leave them in the comments. For software, you'll need to do a couple of things. First, on the SD card, you'll need to install, and this is really important because the wrong operating system will make the following steps not work at all, Raspberry Pi OS Lite. The Lite version does not have a desktop interface. It's all through the command line, but that's okay. Open Media Vault will be our desktop, and we'll install that in a bit. What we want to do is install Raspberry Pi Imager. Put the SD card into our computer using an SD card reader. I've got an affiliate link to one that works well in the description. Click on the Raspberry Pi as our device, and then click Choose Operating System. Then click Raspberry Pi Other and choose Raspberry Pi Lite. Make sure the SD card is selected and not your computer's storage. Once you click Next, you can choose to name your Raspberry Pi. I'm going to call mine Pi NAS 5, no spaces. There's nothing wrong with that name, right? This will be the best Pi NAS ever. Then set your password and don't forget it. Go to Services and enable SSH and write it to the SD card. Put the card into the Pi and connect your drives to it. Then connect the power. If you have Windows, then make sure SSH is enabled in your settings and open up a command prompt. In Linux or Mac, open up Terminal. Find the IP address of your NAS on your network. For Windows users, you can type SSH Pi NAS 5 at and then add your IP address. It will then prompt you to enter your password and you're in. You're officially a hacker. We want to make sure our Pi has all the latest updates. Now type sudo apt-get update and this will update all of its software. Then copy and paste the following code and run it to install Open Media Vault. That should take a couple minutes to install, and after it installs, we want to enable the PCIe Gen 3 speeds in our Pi. So go into the console through SSH on your PC or Mac or whatever, and type sudo nano /boot/firmware /config.txt. Use your down arrow key, scroll down to the end of the file, and type the following code. Then click Ctrl+X and then enter to save the file. Now we can open up Open Media Vault by typing into our browser on our PC or Mac or Linux device or whatever, by typing pi-nas5.local in a browser on a computer connected to the same network. If we go to storage and drives, we can check and see all 4 drives there. Take a note of the name of the first drive. In this case, it's SDA. We'll use that later. Let's set up the RAID array and add a folder for a network drive. Go to Plugins and search for the Multiple Devices plugin. Find it and click Install. Now we'll go to Storage, Multiple Devices, and click Create. Note that these next steps should take a while. The larger the RAID in terabytes, the longer it will take. I think mine took at least an hour. So if you have 40 terabytes, don't be surprised if you're waiting a few hours while the RAID gets set up. I'll be setting up a RAID 5, so I'll choose that as the level, then select the disks you're using. In my case, it's the 4 hard drives we looked at earlier. Click Save and wait for it to update. Don't forget to apply the changes when you're done. When it is done, you can go to Storage, File Systems, and mount the RAID. Click the plus to create and mount the RAID. ext4 is a good bet for type, and then select your RAID 5 you made. Go back to the file systems and click the triangle to mount everything. Choose the ext4 device you just created, and click Save and apply the changes. Now go to Storage, Shared Folders, and click the plus button to create a shared network folder. I'm calling mine Pi_NAS. Choose the file system you created and create a name for the relative path of the folder for your network. In my case, I'm calling it Pi_NAS /, then save and apply the changes. We need to make the folder discoverable on the network, so we need to go to Services, SMB/CIFS, and click Settings. Enable the SMB server and save and apply. Now go to Services, SMB/CIFS, and click Shares. Choose the Pi NAS shared folder you created, a couple of steps back, save, and apply. Okay, more steps. Now go to Users, and click on the shared folder called Pi NAS5, and then click the shared permissions to give everybody read and write access. Save and apply. And we should be good. I can't remember if you need to reboot the NAS or not, but I don't think I did. If not, just reboot it just in case. Anyway, in Windows, you can open up File Explorer and click Map Network Drive. Choose a letter you want the drive to be and search for //pinas5.local. You should see the shared folder when you click Search, and make sure that Reconnect at Sign-in is checked and click OK. Now you should have a new network drive. Nice. So I ran a couple of tests. When my PC is plugged into Ethernet, I get almost gigabit speed, so around 80 to 90 megabytes per second. When connected to Wi-Fi, I only get a tenth of the speed, so about 10 megabytes per second. My Wi-Fi isn't the greatest, so your mileage may vary. If your computer is connected through Ethernet to your router, you may want to buy a USB to Ethernet 2.5 gigabit adapter. I choose not to for one reason. I'm using USB fans. The USB fans, when powered, always run. To keep them from running 24/7, I created a custom script that only runs when the temperature of the hottest hard drive goes over 40 C. They'll stay on until the drive reaches 35 C. I'll put that script on my Buy Me a Coffee page for anyone to check out. If you don't want to use the script, then you could use the USB dimmer switches to keep the fans running all the time, but not at 100% power. They work okay, I think. So here's the script in action. As you can see, the drive I'm monitoring just went over 40C. The fans are on and you can get a good idea of how loud they are. Let's wait a bit until it reaches 34C. It just did. Now the fans will stay off until the drive reaches 40C again. So how would I rate the NAS? Overall, I give it a 4 out of 5. I've been using it for over 3 months. I haven't had any problems with it. I love the thing. It's a great budget-friendly option, but it might not be for everybody. So for the average user, I'd say it's around 3 out of 5. There's just a lot to set up yourself and to figure out. I wouldn't blame you if you went with like a Synology NAS or a newer AMD NAS that are out now. Having said that, the Pi NAS is a decent alternative if you're trying to save a buck and it doesn't use too much power. So for the individual parts, the Raspberry Pi, 4 out of 5. I like them. I use them all the time. There are arguably better single board computers out there than the Raspberry Pi, but Raspberry Pis are great in my opinion. The Ratsa board, 4 out of 5. I love it as well. I give it a 5 out of 5 because of how user-friendly it is. But there are other options out there, and I'm not sure how this one stacks up with the competition. The case, a 4 out of 5. It's a hard drive case. It does the job. It doesn't have really good instructions to show you how to put it together, but it's not complicated. The fans, they're a 3 out of 5. They're a bit loud. They're a bit janky with the connections. Like if I move the USB plug a little bit, it can make the fans turn off. So there are better options, but they do get the job done and keep everything cool as long as I don't move the NAS at all. All the other things like the SATA cables and power adapter are great, but sort of generic. I don't think they're worth rating too much, but I'd use them. They're fine. Now, if you stayed around this long, then as promised, I've got something that I think is worth your while. When you build the NAS like this, the most likely point of failure is the SD card in the Raspberry Pi. If it fails, then you have a headache trying to get everything to work again. Let me show you how to back up your SD card and recover your RAID array if the SD card ever fails. The first thing you want to do is turn off the Pi and take your SD card out and put it in an SD card reader. At this point, you have a couple of choices. If you have another Raspberry Pi with Raspberry Pi OS installed, then you can plug in the card reader to that. Or you can use another SD card with the Raspberry Pi OS on it and stick it into the Pi that you're using for your NAS. Make sure that this new SD card has the regular version of Raspberry Pi S installed on it. Then you'll use a program called PiSafe to create an image of your NAS's SD card that's in your card reader, and it will also compress it. The second option is to plug it into your PC and use Win32 Disk Imager to create a copy of your SD card. On Mac, I'm not exactly sure what option you have, but I'm sure there is one. I'm going with the first option because PiSafe only creates an image of the data on your SD card and then compresses it. Win32 Disk Imager will copy the whole card, even the unused space. So I currently have a 128 gigabyte SD card to run my NAS. That's overkill. If I used Win32 Disk Imager, my backup image would be 128 gigabytes. That's silly. With PiSafe, I ended up with a 3 gigabyte file. I tested it by restoring it to another 16 gigabyte SD card, and it works really well. On your other Raspberry Pi that has a desktop environment, open up the terminal, then paste in this code to install PiSafe. After it has been installed, type bash PiSafe. There are several options like changing the compression level, adding PiSafe to the menu, etc. But to back it up, select Backup in the menu, choose the SD card reader with the image file on it, choose a name for the backup file, and click OK. Because I have a 128 gigabyte SD card, it will need initially at least 120 gigabytes of space on my Raspberry Pi to save it to, so make sure that your Pi has more than that available. Mine does. But this is a reason you'd want to get a smaller SD card for this project in the first place. Once the backup is created, PiSafe will delete all of the unused space and compress it into a file. If your SD card ever fails, you can restore it to a smaller SD card. I restored the image to a 16 gigabyte SD card with no problem, and it worked. Now there is one other caveat. If the SD card fails, a common reason is that you lost power to the Pi, and that can mess up Open Media Vault. When you put in a new SD card, you may see that the RAID file system is missing. You should be able to fix it with the following 3 commands, and I'll put them here. This will unmount and remount the array and help OMV recognize it again. Well, that's it for this video. I can say that I really enjoy my new NAS. I've been saving astrophotography files on it. It's not the fastest, but it's decent. If you enjoyed this video, consider leaving a like and consider subscribing. If you enjoy watching videos about Raspberry Pis, I've got this one that shows you how I use my Raspberry Pi to control my telescope. Thanks for watching.